So in terms of what happened or didn't happen in the Gunpowder Plot in November 1605, we're obliged to rely on a narrative that's in many ways still quite partial. It's been constructed retrospectively, and it sometimes feels like putting together different parts of a jigsaw, of which all the parts of the jigsaw certainly don't survive, and sometimes one has bits of a jigsaw that look as though they're almost from a different jigsaw, that they're incompatible with other pieces of evidence. And this is partly because not all the plotters lived to tell the tale and to assist the Jacobean authorities in explaining what their plans were or what they envisaged happening. The mastermind of the plot was a man called Robert Catesby, a member of the Northamptonshire gentry, charismatic, tall, also very ruthless. He was the one who first had the idea of blowing up the King and the House of Lords at the state opening of Parliament. And there are interesting sort of cultural reasons about why we now tend to associate Guy Fawkes with the centre of the controversy, or he's the person who sort of personifies the plot. But in terms of where the mastermind and where the thinking was coming from, that started with Catesby, who shared his plans in secret with his cousin Thomas Winter in early 1604 and gradually sort of expanded a circle of people, eventually to involve about a dozen. These people were all very well known to one another. They were all obviously staunch Catholics, all mostly in their early 30s and all mostly based in the Midlands. The one person who was the odd one out in a way was Guy Fawkes. He was recruited specifically by Thomas Winter in Flanders. He'd been fighting for the Spanish in the Spanish Netherlands, which is now sort of modern Belgium. And he was recruited specifically for his expertise in explosives. He was a skilled mining engineer, absolutely committed to regime change in England, and also importantly to the plotters, he wasn't known. He'd served on the continent in the military for 10 years, and he wasn't a name or a face that would be known to the Jacobean authorities. And much of what we know about the plot, or at least its inception and its planning and its eventual failure, comes from the confession of two surviving plotters. One of them was Guy Fawkes, but as I sort of said, his main role was actually related to gunpowder. Another was Thomas Winter, with whom Robert Catesby had first shared his views. He was injured in the shootout at Holbeach House and then arrested, and wrote a confession that in its sheer detail, as well as in its theatrical sort of drama, really formed the basis for very early understandings of the plot, and is still one of the main sort of sources for how we can understand how this conspiracy was first formulated. We need to be very clear that Winter may have had his own agenda. I mean, he knew that he would be convicted of treason and executed. And some of the things that he doesn't talk about were presumably precisely to try and save those who hadn't yet been captured. He never mentions his brother Robert, for example, who was certainly one of the plotters. He doesn't mention the priests with whom it's known and suspected that the plotters had talked to and also shared their plans with. So it's a partial, deliberately so, sort of document, but nevertheless very detailed. And Winter claims that when he'd first sort of questioned the radical nature of Catesby's thinking, Catesby had insisted that the violence was absolutely needed. The nature of the disease required so sharp a remedy, as he put it. Simply assassinating the king, a sort of long history of European history of sort of taking out monarchs, that wasn't sufficient for Catesby. That wouldn't solve the problem. As Winter recalled, Catesby had said that to blow up the Parliament House with gunpowder was absolutely necessary. In that place they've done us all the mischief, and perchance God has destined that place for their punishment. So it was symbolic as well as practical. It wasn't just James that was the problem. It was the English Parliament that had passed such an edifice, such a raft of anti-Catholic legislation. You needed to take out not only James, but his heirs, so that it wouldn't immediately pass to his son, Prince Henry. You needed to take out all of the Protestant establishment, all of the nobility, all of the judges, all of the bishops. So, there was a logic to something being enterprised on that scale and inflicting revenge for the very place that had created so much anti-Catholic legislation. Some of the people involved also had helpful links. So Thomas Percy was involved from the outset, and he was a cousin of Henry Percy, 9th Earl of Northumberland, and through him he had access to ministers, and through Percy, that was where initially the plotters rented rooms adjacent to the old Palace of Westminster, and their initial plan, the plotters, was to dig a tunnel underneath this lodging and then to fill that tunnel with gunpowder and ensure that it came up underneath the Houses of Parliament, and ideally schedule a large explosion for the opening of Parliament, which was initially thought to happen in February 1605. The plotters found the tunnelling work much more difficult than they'd initially anticipated. That involved recruiting more people just to help with the labour involved. But then they actually had a sort of lucky break. The outbreak of plague in 1604 meant that and 1605 meant that the scheduled opening of Parliament was delayed until November. In that time as well, a ground floor vault beneath the Houses of Lords became available for rent. Thomas Percy again took the lease of that and installed Guy Fawkes, who wasn't known to anybody, installed him in that lodging as his servant. Meanwhile, the plotters stockpiled large amounts of gunpowder at a safe house in a lodging rented by Catesby in Lambeth, and then very slowly and very discreetly at night ferried that gunpowder back and forwards across the Thames to stockpile it in this lodging under the Palace of Westminster. The barrels of gunpowder were concealed under other forms of firewood and coal and iron bars, partly just to hide them, but also again to maximise the damage of the explosion when it was eventually ignited. And even if over these months some of that gunpowder got decayed, I think it's very difficult ever to overestimate the scale of devastation that the plot would have wreaked had that explosion taken place. As well as the sheer scale of the explosion itself, that would then have obviously set off many secondary fires. There would have been collapsing masonry. 17th century gunpowder had a very high carbon content, so there would have been enormous amounts of deadly fumes of carbon monoxide. So it was very unlikely that anybody who'd been crammed into the small chambers that the Palace of Westminster was in the 17th century would have survived, as well as a huge amount of sort of secondary damage and carnage beyond that. Towards the end of the period leading up to the state opening of Parliament, so in October, Catesby did, however, make a mistake, it appears, in one of his recruits. He approached his cousin, Francis Tresham, who had recently acquired estates, who was part of the same Midlands gentry, committed Catholic, and who had now a very attractive source of finance to help with the project. It seems from the outset as though Francis Tresham was absolutely shocked by the scale and carnage that Catesby was envisaging. He's thought to have offered Catesby a large sum of money to try and sort of dissuade him. I mean, to Tresham's mind, this was not justified. This was not advancing God's work through wreaking this kind of devastation. And the plotters were just being too reckless. I mean, whatever happened, Tresham thought, if the plan failed, the fate of all of England's Catholics would be bound up with the desperate few who had conceived so bold and desperate a scheme. Tresham became frightened and angry about having been tricked into an oath of secrecy. He had sworn an oath of secrecy and was worried that he would jeopardise his soul if he betrayed it. On the other hand, he was desperate to alert the authorities, and particularly his own relatives. So it's thought that it was Tresham who sent an anonymous warning that he hoped would reach his brother-in-law, who was a Catholic peer, William Parker, Lord Monteagle. And the reason that the plot failed was that on the night of the 26th of October 1605, an unknown messenger, described as an unknown man, gave a cryptic letter in the street to Thomas Ward, one of Lord Monteagle's servants, specifically warning Monteagle not to attend the opening of Parliament in a few days' time. The letter read, "My lord, out of the love I have for some of your friends, I want to make sure you're safe. Because of this, I'd advise you not to attend the sitting of Parliament, because God and men have agreed to punish the wickedness of this time. Don't think this is a joke. Go to your estate in the country where you'll be safe, because although there is no sign of a problem yet, this Parliament will nevertheless receive a terrible blow, but they will not see who it is that hurts them. This advice shouldn't be ignored, as it may do you some good, and it can do you no harm because the danger will have passed as soon as you've burned this letter. I hope God grants you the grace to make good use of it, and that he protects you." And Monteagle was so shocked by the content of this letter, he immediately took it to Whitehall. Privy councillors were meeting. Robert Cecil, the Secretary of State, wasn't sure what to make of it, or claimed to be very mystified by its sort of enigmatic warning, but he decided to defer doing anything until King James returned from hunting several days later. When James returned on the 30th of October, he read it and was initially alarmed. He initially suspected some kind of gunpowder explosion, ordered that the Palace of Westminster be searched. It was searched and nothing untoward was found. At the same time, on the 1st of November, Tresham had met Catesby and Thomas Winter again at Barnet and had urged them not to go ahead with the plan. By this stage, Catesby and Winter suspected that Tresham was the person who'd betrayed them. It became known that an anonymous tip-off had been received, and the plotters had to decide whether to go ahead or not. They had begun to formulate a sort of secondary plan in terms of what would happen after the explosion. And insofar as the details of that plan had been worked out, the idea was to foment a rebellion in the Midlands, close to their own estates and their family bases. The idea was also to try, if possible, to kidnap James's daughter, Princess Elizabeth, who lived with her guardian, John Harrington, Lord Harrington, at Coombe Abbey near Coventry. Perhaps the idea of abducting Princess Elizabeth, who at this stage was 9 or 8, was that she could be married perhaps to a Catholic consort and installed as a sort of puppet Catholic sovereign in a new reign, as a sort of new Elizabeth II. So even when the plotters began to learn that an anonymous tip-off had been received, they decided nevertheless to go ahead with their plan. Catesby and Thomas Percy set off for the Midlands. Thomas Winter remained in London. Another search of Parliament was ordered on the night of the 4th of November, and it was in that search that the 36 barrels of gunpowder were discovered, as well as a man who claimed that his name was John Johnson, who history knows as Guy Fawkes. For those plotters who'd remained in London, Christopher Wright came to Thomas Winter's chambers on the 5th of November and said, "The matter is discovered." Winter went along to Parliament and found the very sort of high security, and then rode off to join the rest of the plotters in the Midlands. So for the Catholic gentry that met in the Midlands, some of them were told that James VI and I had been killed, that a rising was imminent, that this was the moment to effect regime change. But very quickly, it seemed that the appetite for radical rebellion wasn't there. The majority of the gentry quickly went back to their estates, took fright at what they were hearing, and by the time that the plotters had raided Warwick Castle for some more ammunition and made it to Holbeach House, by the time the authorities arrived and caught up with Catesby and the others, there were only 14 plotters left. There was a shootout and Catesby and others were killed. Thomas Winter was injured and taken to London, and the plot, as we know it, was over.